Hey, Mihir, am I saying your name?
Yeah, it's Mihir. Hi, nice to meet you.
Hey. Yeah.
It's can I address you by like Mr. Ananthram or
You can just call me Amith.
Amith? Amith
Yeah,
works. All
yeah,
right, great. Thank you for taking your time to come speak with me.
yeah, totally. Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Yeah. So we were interested in the work that you did with natural language processing and understanding emotional connections of humans through models and through a variety of like corpuses of data. So we were wondering, just to start things off, great to see and speak with you. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself and your journey in like computer science and natural language processing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm from like Northern Virginia, DC suburbs. Kind of in college, like for my undergrad, I kind of started out as like a classics major, doing like Latin and Greek, and then kind of came to computer science a little bit later. And then when I graduated undergrad, I was like a software engineer out in kind of the Bay Area in California for 5-ish years. And kind of there, I was just kind of doing normal kind of back-end engineering, like systems design type things. Um, but at the time, I had kind of become interested in NLP, just because it's kind of like a marriage of like some of my interests. Like I'm like interested in language and how it works. Like I read a lot of like fiction.
Sure.
So kind of the idea that one could build like a computational model of language was like quite exciting to me. So yeah, after kind of doing my software engineering for 5-ish years, I like was trying to kind of study NLP on the side, but finding I didn't really have the bandwidth for it. So I decided to come back to grad school for it. And that's what I'm doing now. So I'm in a PhD program. I'm like maybe a little bit over halfway through. So what kind of my area of focus is on like image conditioned language generation.
Sure.
So like if you played around with GPT-4's like vision version, it's basically that. Can you give a kind of a model an image and then have it generate something about the image that demonstrates some real understanding of the image. And kind of the task that I'm focusing on of late is like generating descriptions of works of art.
Hmm.
Because um, I like art, so it's like another kind of way to fold in something I'm interested in, but I also think it's
Yep.
kind of a nice test bed for these models' capabilities. Like I think like good artwork or like interesting artwork is typically like surprising. It has kind of something novel to it. So kind of like it's inherently like out of distribution or like a little less common. So it kind of stresses the ability of these models to reason about images that they maybe didn't see in their training sets. So I kind of like that. And then I also kind of like this idea that art is quite the experience of it is quite like subjective. Like when you see
Sure.
artwork and I see artwork, we're going to see it, experience it quite differently based on kind of how we grew up, and kind of even individual like brain chemistry differences too,
Right.
probably.
It's different for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm also interested in kind of like whose perspective these vision and language models are actually reflecting or modeling. So when
Sure.
GPT-4 generates a description of an image, like whose description of that image is that for like pretty objective tasks like you know identifying a breed of dog, it doesn't matter that much. But for kind of if I showed a bunch of images and try to have it understand what's going on there, and it's like I'm Indian, so if it's like a bunch of images of like a what I know looks like a Hindu wedding,
Mhm.
like is it going to be able to recognize it as that, or will it say something very general, like oh, it's just like a gathering of family members? So
Yeah.
uh, I kind of think that latter thing is an ability it needs to have to actually be able to kind of reason about artwork.
Mhm.
So yeah. Sorry, it was a little roundabout, but that's
No,
kind of
no,
what.
for sure.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really interesting. I like your path seems like very natural, right? You had your interest in software engineering and your interest in the classics. I thought that was interesting, starting point. It started from the classics and then working your way into this this kind of separate field, not as connected. And going off that, is there anything that like I know you mentioned right working at Stripe and getting a an interest. Sorry, I read about you get working
Sure,
at
yeah.
Stripe, but yeah. Um, uh, but was there any specific moment that like sparked like a specific moment or specific instance where you could really see uh that mix of AI, art, NLP as your future? Like, is there any like, you know, moment?
I think it happened like a little bit slowly. Like I think when I was a software engineer, I kind of was operating like I always thought language tech was cool, but I kind of just assumed that everybody thought it was cool,
Mhm.
which is like I think a little silly in retrospect. I think the things that you think are cool are probably because you like those things more than
Yeah.
like other things. So I think it was kind of a moment of like taking my interests more seriously. And then I think the art focus kind of happened a little bit naturally as I like, read more in the field and tried to kind of get a sense of like where the actual frontier of model performance is, like what are interesting open questions. And I kind of stumbled upon kind of this webpage that was talking about the ADA, which is I think the acronym is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Basically mandates that like museum websites online are like accessible to people. So what that typically means is for people who are like either blind or like vision impaired, like images should have accompanying alt text that describes what's in the image, because those people are reliant on screen readers. So like when they're reading a website, images are read out to them, and if there's no alt text there, basically it's like a big blank square on the page for them. And like websites are pretty delinquent about this. Like even kind of your best funded museums don't do this. And they are kind of like best situated to do it. So like on Instagram, when people are posting photos, like people are never adding alt text. So I kind of became interested in this problem of how do you automatically generate alt text. So for photographs, existing captioning systems work quite well, but for artwork, it's like a little bit uh, kind of iffier. So yeah, I think kind of just reading more about kind of the state of the technical area and then kind of reading broadly. So that's where the kind of the application came from. And then I was like, okay, yeah, this is actually kind of a research direction I'd be interested in. So
Sure.
hmm.
And then just a brief specific question that I had. So you distinguish between photographs and artwork. Where's like the line between, an interesting picture and an interesting piece of artwork in your opinion or with your
Oh yeah,
experience?
totally. Yeah, I think that it's hard to say, kind of like give you like a rule, and I think a lot of it is like context based too. I guess the distinction I was trying to make was kind of uh, it's not true anymore, but kind of earlier image captioning systems were their performance was really bound by the types of like annotated data sets that they had. And those typically were like photographs of like recognizable people, places, and things. So like a dog running in a field or Barack Obama meeting Angela Merkel, like those systems could kind of caption those images,
Yeah.
but like if you gave it like a painting of Matisse or something, it would struggle a little bit more.
Mhm.
So that's kind of what I mean. When I mean say photographs, I mean like things that were more in distribution at that
Mhm.
time. Now model performance is actually quite better at kind of describing images. Like if you give GPT-4 a work of art, it should be able to describe it like reasonable detail, though it'll still kind of like make things up. It still has kind of like a hallucination issue, and I from my kind of like anecdotal experiments have noticed that it's like a little bit kind of worse for artwork. But yeah, that's what I mean. So
Right. So yeah, I see a lot of your work revolves around the AI and art. And through reading about your work, I mean I saw some of your papers regarding the feeling blue,
mhm.
the and the social orientation feature paper. Uh that
Oh
was
sure, yeah.
that's pretty recent.
Mhm.
So what I know the Feeling Blue paper was a pretty big paper. So was there anything specific, was there any like recent papers that you really felt like, you really thought were important and had lots of potential like real world applications? And could you give like a simple overview of that work?
Sure. You mean my work in particular, or
Yes, yeah.
oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm actually working on submitting a paper right now. on basically trying to systematically evaluate like whose perspective vision and language models are
Yeah,
actually like
you
in.
touched on that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So basically what we do is we have a bunch of tasks that are kind of range from the objective to the subjective. Like on the objective side, we have like object identification, kind of question answering, like how
Mhm.
many people are drinking coffee in this image. That's kind of like an example question. And on the subjective side, it's like art emotion classification. And we have kind of images and annotations from like Western countries, the US, North America, kind of generally, and Western Europe, and China. And basically what we do is we kind of show that existing vision and language models perform much better on kind of the Western subset of these tasks than the Eastern subset.
Mhm.
Um, and we basically kind of have two questions. So one is a lot of these models are actually multilingual. So GPT-4 can respond to you in Chinese. So if you
Mhm.
prompt it in Chinese, does it get better at understanding images from China, or does it
Mhm.
actually get better at reflecting the emotional response to artwork of Chinese language speakers? So that was kind of one question that we had. And the other question is like what decisions kind of affect that bias. Like, so we find that all the models are better on the Western images. So that's like this bias. So what modeling decisions affect that bias? So we have kind of like two interesting results. Like one is that one contributor to that perspective that the model has is actually the text that it sees during language only pre-training. So we have one model that's like mostly like English and another model that's like bilingual English and Chinese model. And these are trained on like text only, no images.
Mhm.
And then we kind of make them multimodal in the same way with the same set of images. So the only difference between the two models is how much Chinese they saw during initial model
Training.
pre-training.
Yeah.
And we find that the model that was trained on more on a more balanced mix of English and Chinese is less biased. So it's like less biased on the subjective tasks for art and motion classification, but it's also less biased on the more objective tasks,
Mhm.
which is kind of like an interesting finding. And we find that it's less biased when you query the model in English, and then it's much less biased when you query the model in Chinese. So reducing querying the model, the mostly English model in Chinese, it happens to kind of know Chinese because it actually doesn't take that much Chinese data to leak into the model training to make
Mhm.
it multilingual.
Wow.
But it's not actually reflecting a Chinese language speaker's perspective. But when you build a model kind of with much more Chinese from the beginning, it does actually reflect a Chinese language speaker. Which is interesting. So basically, like, image understanding kind of leverages, at least in this setting, like text corpora kind of embody kind of like the views and kind of world knowledge of the people that write the text.
Mhm.
So the idea here is that if you train a model on Chinese language text online, that Chinese language text probably has more of the concept associations and things that are required to both make sense of images from China and kind of reflect the way that Chinese language speakers make sense of those images. So yeah, I think that's kind of like a nice, interesting result. And I think like useful in the sense that I think one kind of worry for a lot of people working in AI research is that like the internet is not a perfectly representative place of like the
Sure.
world, right?
For sure.
Like it overrepresents younger people, it represents people who grew up in Western countries or English speaking. Like men, for example, are more prominent on like places like Reddit. So if we build a lot of language tech on this data from the internet, what that'll actually do is it will kind of uh, like preserve and maybe even exacerbate this like
These
unrepresentative power
biases.
dynamic online. Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's called like I don't know, there's different terms for it, like algorithmic hegemony and things like
Mhm.
that. So kind of understanding uh, the consequences of that, I think is like quite important in terms of characterization. So that's like one thing that the paper tries to do is try to characterize the consequences. And the second thing is try to like understand where it comes from. So partly it's actually from, the language that you train on too. So you can't just take an English multimodal model and then make it kind of understand Chinese with a small amount of like Chinese fine tuning because that's actually that's closer to taking an English language speaker and like putting him through a machine translation system and not
Mhm.
actually kind of taking a native Chinese language speaker. So yeah, that's one example. So
Mhm. Right. So Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. One of your points on, I can definitely see that the English Chinese model would be better at like subjective tasks, but it's interesting that the performance in objective tasks also improves, considering that, I'd assume that at the more general tasks they'd have a similar performance, but it's pretty interesting that just I don't know if you could call it a perspective, but having the understanding of the Chinese language also kind of varies its performance in just general tasks.
Yeah, I was actually more surprised by that result too. I kind of was expecting the subjective result. Like it's definitely the case that the effect size that we see is much larger for the
Mhm.
subjective task than the objective tasks. But for the objective task, we do actually see it. And I think you can kind of make sense of it. Like one of our objective tasks is an object identification benchmark called Dollar Street.
Mm.
And it's like this
Okay.
website where people can upload pictures of everyday objects in their house from around the world. So we compare images uploaded by American users to images uploaded by Chinese users. So that'll be like a photo of my house or my couch or my cooking utensils. And we actually do see kind of a reduction in bias on this benchmark too. And I think you can make sense of it because like maybe Chinese language text has some like word associations in it that help you
Hmm.
understand that this is like this rice cooker is like a cooking utensil, cooking instrument versus, something else in the
Yeah,
entire.
or like,
Yeah.
yeah, like household names for different items could be different.
Yeah, yeah. I think like one example we have is like this door is open and there's a lot of like American food products in it. And like that kind of makes it recognizable as like a fridge.
Mhm.
But uh, you have to kind of use the context clues and be like, okay, if I have like kind of these different items in it, in kind of like a Western setting, it's more likely to be a fridge.
Mhm.
I think like the more classical examples are like celebrations and weddings and things like that. Like a wedding in China looks different than a wedding here.
Right.
You see like a white dress. Um, the English LM kind of associates that with a wedding more strongly than the Chinese LM does.
Mhm.
So.
Right. And then so considering all these different findings of how there's a significant like Western bias to all the available or a majority of the online text-based data, how do you think there's been a constant conversation, a constant like interest in reducing bias and increasing the fairness in AI.
Mhm.
How do you think that people that are interested in doing this kind of work go about addressing this issue?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know if I have like a good answer for you. I think um like I think one thing is that like, you know, there are pretty good machine translation systems, but at least our work seems to suggest that like machine translation is not an actual way to like preserve culturally specific perspective. You actually need naturally occurring text
Hmm.
of that language online at a minimum. So for languages like Chinese, we have enough of it online, but for like lower resource languages, like my family speaks Kannada, and there's not a lot of Kannada online. So I think kind of if you're interested in this line of work, kind of lower resource languages depend more on methods that are able to generalize from small amounts of data, which is not kind of the trend anymore
Hmm.
because scaling has been so effective in AI. But that's kind of an area where you could focus your work is how do you go from the small number of examples to kind of a general worldview, which you can operationalize. So that would be one area to focus. I think another area to focus, which is not AI specific, is just generally kind of like digital in the digital humanities, like cultural preservation work. Like there is probably a lot of kind of language text in newspapers and stuff like that that hasn't been digitized. So can we
Hmm.
get some of that stuff online? I think that's actually like a super worthy undertaking. So kind of those are two things off the top of my head. And I guess the third thing is like I think there's like this nice paper that I think is kind of like a position paper called Language Models as Agent Models. And I think what's interesting about this paper is that it says that we train language models to basically recreate all the text online, but that text online comes from many different voices. So to actually do this correctly, the LM probably needs to implicitly model who the speaker is early in the sentence to be able to complete the sentence. So I think there's this idea of like, can we explicitly model this stuff, like rather than train kind of this generic LM that is everybody's voices
Mhm.
during training, can we somehow like make clear whose perspective is being modeled and kind of like factor that out of the model. So that's kind of like a modeling side thing that I think is kind of exciting and promising. So
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, I just wanted to pivot a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So, I read about your experience and you talked about your experience in, now in academia and previously in industry.
Mhm.
So what are some key differences or key similarities that you've noticed in terms of the approaches to research, goals and challenges, or maybe not research, just anything in general, just approaches, goals and challenges, stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I didn't do research in industry, so I can't really say there, but I do think like in industry, you're typically on like a team and kind of like working towards the same end goal. So there's like I think kind of like very natural kinds of like collaboration there. I kind of think in academia, collaboration happens, but you have to kind of seek it out a little bit more and kind of find people that you work well with who have interests that are aligned with yours. So that's kind of one difference. I also think academia kind of requires a type of internal motivation and kind of like discipline in scheduling that you don't really need kind of in a like a software job, like kind of deadlines are not flexible in industry, but they are kind of flexible in academia. So that kind of requires, being your own boss a little bit. So, which I think is like a good muscle to learn, but you just kind of have to learn it here. That's one kind of dynamic that's different. I think you have a lot more freedom to kind of explore areas that you're interested in academia. I think in industry you have to kind of do stuff that the team needs, which makes sense. But here, if I have an interesting research question, I can kind of like pitch it to my advisor and then go from there. Um, so yeah, those are kind of obvious ones that pop out to me. I am kind of glad that I worked for a little bit before coming back to academia. I think it helped me, it gave me a chance to like mature a little bit, kind of like understand what kind of like a full-time job feels like, have like develop like good like software engineering skills. I think that's like, kind of like served me well in the research world. Like
Right.
I know
That
much,
was
yeah.
That was the question I was going to ask you. I was going to ask, like, I know you touched on it regarding like scheduling, but do you think your experiences, right? I'm not exactly how sure how the academia to industry or industry to academia, like the specific order that pipeline typically goes, but do you think that your experiences like working in the industry allow you to approach certain I don't know, academic problems differently? And like, if so, how and it's probably hard to, verbalize how you can approach it differently, but how could, how best could you state that difference in approach, if there is
Yeah,
one?
like I think I think I have like a way of doing things that I recognize to be like efficient in industry. But I think kind of translating it to academia is like non-obvious in some ways. Like I think you have to kind of like learn how to do research and then adapt that to kind of the ways in which you're productive in industry. So like now when I approach a research problem, I'm like, oh, okay, this is an interesting question. I've gotten better at like finding papers that might be related to it, kind of just like by knowing what to search for now. So once I've done that, can I get like quick feedback on this idea, which is kind of like a thing that I'd want to have done in industry too, but like in academia, I had to kind of learn how to do it in a research setting. So what's like the smallest experiment I can kind of construct to get like immediate feedback on this and then go from there. So it's a lot more about like I think it's like similar to industry where you want to kind of like de-risk research projects because like a lot of your ideas, like even your like best motivated ideas won't work, and then things that like don't seem well motivated might work. So you have to kind of get early signal, kind of iterate very quickly, and I think that is kind of like a little bit like a startup approach to research a little bit. So like I'm glad I learned that in industry, but I don't think I was able to adapt it to academia right away. I kind of had
Mhm,
to make some mistakes in different
mhm.
research projects and then kind of learn from that too.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably it. I think like it helped to be kind of like a experienced software engineer when I came in. Like I think I have like pretty good code hygiene and like I test my research code, which I don't think is that common.
Mhm,
But I wonder a little bit how useful that will remain in the future with kind of increasingly good code gen. So yeah.
Right. So just one or two more questions to wrap it up here. So this is a little bit more of a outer perspective on these things, but uh, you mentioned your work with trying to label creative pieces of art, and other just like language heavy fields or language or creative heavy fields like healthcare, writing, law, music, they've been traditionally viewed as like requiring skills that are uniquely human. But your work as well as work from many other people, um, shows that, do you ever see like AI eventually matching or surpassing the human capabilities in those areas? Or and like additionally, what kind of like new human AI collaborative situations do you foresee like arising due to that?
Yeah, I guess I don't know. Like I would like to think that like at least in like the realm of like art creation, like I don't think it is that often about the execution as much as it is about like the idea that like the artist has. And I think typically those ideas are best formed when somebody has some like real life experience to draw from. Like I don't think existing language tech is it. That's not to say that it could never happen, I guess. But I just don't really think it's going to happen from just like scaling on its own. Like I know people will say that like AI generated poetry has like won poetry contests and things like that, but I don't think that's like quite the same as like, you know, you read like Dostoevsky and have like a transformative experience
Yeah.
reading that. Like I think I will be I feel like that is kind of like a ways off. Uh, so I do think it could be, I don't know, for things that are less, I guess the other thing about art is like the reaction is like very subjective too. Like my favorite bands are not other people's favorite bands. So like what would this model need to know about me to generate artwork that like really strikes a chord with me?
Sure.
Like right now, I can find a band that strikes a chord with me, and it just happens to happen that way. You know, that some person is kind of like speaking their truth, and it happens to kind of overlap enough with my truth that like there's like resonance there.
Mhm.
So like how much of myself do I want to expose to this model that it's able to actually do that? Like, I don't know. That seems I'm skeptical. But for things that are like more like objective, like healthcare and stuff like that, like I kind of hope that this tech does not like replace doctors, but like complement them enough that like the floor of people's medical care is like much higher. Just because the same doctor can treat like 100x patients or something like that.
Mhm.
And that seems more feasible and doable, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So the innately creative fields like art and music still a ways off before we can see that AI or models being able to create things that evoke emotion to each person individually. Whereas healthcare, like you stated, healthcare is maybe it isn't close, but we all want it to be closer to that goal so everyone can benefit.
Yeah, I think so. And that's not to say that like, I don't know. I'm sure you could use Stable Diffusion to generate like reasonably good looking illustrations for your website or whatever.
Mhm.
But I think for like, you know, like meaningful works of art that like touch you, I like would be surprised to experience that from something that has no human in the loop. Like I think people could use AI as a tool to produce that, but yeah. So
And then just one last question to close it off, right? We're still in high school and you're through all these different adventures and parts of your life. So what advice would you give aspiring students interested in pursuing a career in AI or natural language processing?
Yeah, sure. So I think definitely don't shirk your math. I feel like math is like pretty important.
Yeah,
I definitely when I came back to grad school had to kind of reteach myself stuff that I just hadn't used in a while. But I think it's useful to give you kind of a mechanistic understanding of like what's going on with deep learning. So that's kind of like a blanket thing. I guess in general, I would kind of also suggest like if you feel like don't buy in too hard to kind of like a left brain right brain
mhm,
binary. Like I think like it number one it like doesn't exist. I don't think like in the cognitive sciences they have like evidence of it. But I think like AI is like increasingly becoming like a pretty interdisciplinary field. Like it's nice to kind of bring your background and excitement about something that's not specifically computer science to computer science and kind
right,
of marry the two there. And I also just think that like our brains are like complicated enough that, you can learn transferable ways of critical thinking in one domain and have it kind of be useful somewhere else.
right,
You can't like explain it on paper. Um, the oh yeah, I guess also just kind of like, if you are really interested in AI, like definitely play around with kind of AI tools as they come out, like try to stress test them, like fold them into your life. And yeah, I guess those are kind of like the big ones. Like once you get to like college, and you start taking like CS classes, um, like definitely like show up to class, kind of make sure the prof knows who you are,
yeah,
like swing by office hours,
mhm,
kind of that's like the legwork you have to do to be able to get kind of research opportunities with different
mhm,
labs. And then once you have a research opportunity, like, really give it like a real try to sound it out. Definitely kind of take that opportunity as an undergrad. Um, yeah, I think those are kind of the main ones. So
great. Well, thank you so much, Amith, for all your time with us
yeah,
today.
totally. Yeah, thanks for reaching out, and good luck with whatever's next. So
Awesome. Thank you. Have a nice day.
you too. Bye.
Bye bye.